It's 6 o'clock on Thursday, the 8th of February. Good morning. This is Today with John Humphreys and Justin Webb.
The BBC News is read by Zeb Soames.
The billionaire investor George Soros has given £400,000 to a group campaigning against Brexit. The Best for Britain group wants to persuade MPs to vote against the final deal Theresa May negotiates with the EU. It believes this would then cause a general election or a new referendum. Executives from Japanese companies in the UK, including the car makers Nissan, Honda and Toyota, are due to meet Theresa May and the Chancellor Philip Hammond at Downing Street later today. Japanese firms have invested heavily in the British car industry in recent decades, but are concerned they could face export tariffs and lengthy customs delays once Britain leaves the EU.
It is now 8 minutes past 6. Quick look at the front pages. The Telegraph leads with a story that says George Soros, the billionaire, known as the man who broke the Bank of England, is backing a campaign to overturn Brexit. The investor says the Telegraph is one of three senior figures linked to the Remain supporting campaign group Best for Britain, who plan to launch a nationwide advertising campaign this month, which they hope will lead to a second referendum to keep Britain in the EU. The campaign is trying to recruit major Tory donors in an attempt to undermine Theresa May.
The Liberal Democrat leader and former business secretary Sir Vince Cable said one of the key objectives of American trade negotiators in any post-Brexit deal would be to secure access for US companies to do business in the NHS.
Can she give an absolute guarantee that in those negotiations the NHS will be excluded from their scope? And can she confirm that in her conversations with President Trump, she's made it absolutely clear to him that the NHS is not for sale?
Theresa May spoke to Donald Trump on Tuesday, but didn't mention the president's recent criticism of the health service on Twitter. And she didn't mention the NHS when she replied to the Lib Dem leader.
He doesn't know what they're going to say in their
24 minutes to 7 now. Theresa May and Philip Hammond will meet representatives of some of the biggest Japanese businesses operating in Britain today, and they'll be very anxious to keep them sweet. Simon Jack is our business editor. Anxious, Simon, because they employ an awful lot of people here, especially the car makers.
Well, that's right. I mean, as you say, there will be Japanese bank and pharmaceutical chiefs, but the focus really will be on Nissan, Honda and Toyota. They've spent billions over the last 30 years investing in plants that make half of the 1.7 million cars that are made here in the UK. Most of those are for export. Most of those exports go to the EU. Now, this meeting was arranged by Downing Street when they went over to Japan, but it comes at a very, very sensitive time. Of course, we've had these sort of no ifs, no buts, no customs union from the government recently, and just in the last 24 hours, these civil service impact assessment papers have been leaking out in dribs and drabs, and they have some pretty stark things to say about the car industry in particular, saying that the impact in three different scenarios, if you like, the Norway scenario, the Canada scenario, and the no-deal WTO scenario, that range of outcomes could impact the car industry between 5 and 13%. And in a business with small margins, that's going to be very difficult. So they're going to want some clarity. Now, you should say, of course...
It is now 8 minutes to 7. We don't know exactly what the rules will be governing immigration from EU countries after Britain's left the European Union, but we do know that the government has said the present system of free movement of people across the EU will end. The Scottish government says that's an approach that will do significant damage to the Scottish economy because it relies on thousands of migrants coming to the country to work every year. A Scottish Government report released yesterday says there's an overwhelming case for Scotland to be allowed to operate a separate immigration policy from the rest of the UK and to continue to allow free movement from the EU. It is now 21 minutes to 9. George Soros, the man who broke the Bank of England, is now using some of his money to try to thwart Brexit. At least that's the Daily Telegraph's interpretation of what's happening. Mr. Soros, who made $1 billion 25 years ago betting against sterling, has donated £400,000 to a campaign group that is fighting to keep Britain in the European Union. Lord Malloch Brown chairs that group, former minister himself, Labour Minister, of course. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Subverting democracy.
No, I think empowering democracy is our view. I mean, we think there are a lot of people out there terribly frustrated, growing in numbers, and so we're putting together a campaign which is actually democratic in its funding too. It's got some big donors, including, I'm very proud to say, George Soros, but also thousands of small donors as well.
In order to do what?
Well, to mobilised public opinion in favour of Remain in order to, if you like, sort of bring that awareness of public change, of that change in public opinion to bear on Parliament when it has the meaningful vote on Mrs May's Brexit package sometime at the end of this year.
Do MPs really need to be reminded of what is at stake here?
I certainly think they do, because, a majority of MPs still, I think, personally remain Remainers, and yet are about to vote for anything between a hard and a soft Brexit, either one of which would be a tremendous betrayal of the economic interests of this country's future.
And are they not aware of that? I mean, it's a bit extraordinary, isn't it, that somebody who's been elected MP, who's been serving in the House of Commons, maybe for many, many years, is not aware of the stakes?
Well, look, we are a parliamentary democracy, and when we went to a referendum in the first place, we arguably betrayed that sort of Burkean character of our democracy.
Entirely.
And so I think, I wish MPs would take responsibility for this and would be willing to vote their conscience and vote their knowledge of the issues and then face their electors at the next general election. But I think...
And do what? And overturn the result of the referendum?
Well,
overturn
17.4
million
John,
votes?
I mean, I don't know quite why with this referendum it's the only occasion ever that a referendum is the final last sort of sealed in concrete
That's what
verdict.
we were told.
Well, no, because...
Perfectly good reason for that.
Then why wasn't the 1970s referendum the last word on it? Why do we have repeated elections? Because situations change.
Because we elect a parliament
minds.
for a certain term. The British people were asked whether they wanted to leave the European Union, and they voted by a majority, about 1.5 million, that they did.
Well, I mean, it's like being told, let's go to Cornwall for a beach holiday, and it's going to be sunny, and it rains every day. Are you allowed to change your mind? I mean, I think it's no mistake.
Are you serious?
Hold on.
You don't mean that.
I do. I think it's no mistake that this story runs the same day that actually the BBC is running the fact that every region of this country, but particularly leave regions, are going to suffer economically because of this choice. I think it is absolutely the nature of democracy that people are allowed to reflect on whether they'd anticipated these storms, and if they hadn't, to have a chance to decide whether the package that Mrs May negotiates is one that we as British citizens can support.
You're ignoring the fact that we have had a perfectly legal referendum, and that all the arguments that you put now were put them, and that people weighed them and found them wanting, and they voted by a large majority to leave the European Union. If that isn't a subversion of the democratic process, it's hard to know what is.
Look, John, they were given a set of facts where both sides really just, on the one side, exaggerated the risks of leaving and were properly, I think, seen through. And on the other side, equally sort of vainly and misleadingly missold the advantages of leaving, claiming there were going to be 350 million a week extra for the national health. Now that we've seen that actually the truth, the economic truth is settling, as there is going to be damage from Brexit, exactly how much and how quickly does still remain a matter of debate, and that, I think it's perfectly reasonable that people should look at that final deal and either through their parliament or through a second referendum make a judgment whether it lives up to the promise offered in the first referendum.
But if it is as simple and straightforward and provable as you're suggesting here, are people just too thick to understand this for themselves? Do they really need to be told by a very, very richly funded campaign that it is contrary to what they believe?
It's well funded, but a fraction of the money spent to persuade people to leave in the first referendum, which was also backed by very, very rich individuals like the Barclay brothers in the Channel Islands and goodness what. I mean, I think let's look at the essence of this. The the first referendum was, yes, about the issues you mentioned, but it was also a howl of protest from large parts of the country at the failure of the political system to listen and respond to their issues and problems.
All right.
I think now we have a very specific package coming into view, and I think everybody deserves the right to decide whether or not it's going to help or hinder the solutions to problems such as healthcare, housing, jobs.
All right. Lord Malloch-Brown, thank you very much.